Welcome to Concordia Church Online.
So let me tell you about one of my dad's yearly pursuits. Sort of that dream of striking it rich. Now, it wasn't gambling. Dad didn't gamble. We didn't gamble and really believe in that. We worked too hard for our money to just kind of throw it away. Also, it wasn't a lottery or a casino in every state like there is now. Dad's thing was every year something would come around in a huge envelope called Publishers Clearinghouse Sweepstakes. Dad always looked forward to opening that up and filling it out and putting the stamp on there. And sometimes I got to take that down to the mailbox and throw it in the mailbox and hope that, hey, maybe we're going to be the ones to strike it rich. That was kind of fun to hope and to dream. We never won, but it is nice to dream, isn't it? It's not still nice to dream of striking it rich. And in the story Jesus tells us today, he actually invites you to consider, well, maybe you already have. Now, there's lots of dreaming that was going on in Jesus' day too, about striking it rich and finding buried treasure or some big jewel that had never been seen before. That was pretty common. In Jesus' time, pearls were very prized, not just for their value, for how much they cost, but for their beauty, which also drove up the cost. And there was this hope of finding some huge undiscovered pearl while you're swimming in the Mediterranean Sea, maybe something like the pearl that Cleopatra had that would, in today's money, be worth about $28 million. And then the dream of finding buried treasure, well, that was even more common in Jesus' time, because there was this common practice of using fields as kind of like the bank. People would hide their valuables in fields and had been doing it for a long time, especially when there were invading armies coming through, and that happened a lot. See, these armies would come and they'd kill a bunch of people and they'd cart off the stuff that was in the buildings, but they wouldn't usually look underground. They didn't have time to do something like that. So the practice is bury your treasure and then run to safety, and then at some time when you can, come back and find that again, and in that way you could restore or preserve most of your assets, or at least the most important ones. Now that was a really good practice if, well, you survived the invasion in the first place, and then you remembered exactly where you buried it and could find it without any of the landmarks that you used to have, and then you didn't die before you could come back and reclaim it. But if any of those things happened, well, the treasure is probably going to be lost and buried and out of sight and forgotten for generations, perhaps forever. Now, since Palestine was the site of a whole bunch of different battles over the years, and a lot of losing battles, so that meant a lot of people were killed and weren't coming back for that treasure that they had buried. There were all these stories in Jesus' time about, hey, maybe there's buried treasure here or here or here. And then you add to the fact that in Jesus' time, a whole lot of people didn't have a whole lot of stuff. And so they had this dream of striking it rich. And so it's no wonder that these stories of buried treasure were really, really common. It's also not surprising that Jesus, the master storyteller, tells a story to his audience about finding buried treasure, with a little bit of a twist, because he wants us to see something about God and our relationship with him. We find that as we found these other stories in Matthew chapter 13. Listen in.
The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man discovered hidden in a field. In his excitement, he hid it again and sold everything he owned to get enough money to buy the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant on the lookout for choice pearls. When he discovered a pearl of great value, he sold everything he owned and bought it.
You know, like I said, these stories of buried treasure, they're pretty common in Jesus' time. And there were also some pretty common themes that wove through those stories. One of those themes was you'd find this buried treasure and then build yourself a great big palace. That's kind of the rags to riches theme. Another common thing, especially in these stories of pearls, was that you'd find this amazing pearl and then it was kind of a reward for being good. It's sort of a riches as a reward for virtue or for sincere faith kind of a theme. And then there were these stories where your newfound money would save you from some sort of catastrophe. That's sort of the money's your security blanket sort of thing. Does that sound pretty contemporary? Those sort of themes that we tend to apply not just to life, but also to faith. And I suppose when Jesus told his treasure stories, what his audience is expecting is he's going to just use one of those three common themes that were floating around in the treasure stories of the day, and then he just kind of make a little twist and apply it to faith. And he doesn't. He doesn't use those themes. Instead, Jesus tells these stories with sort of an unexpected twist to emphasize a point that his hearers really didn't see coming. Because Jesus' point in the stories here is not so much like in those common themes of the day on the actions of the persons finding the treasure. His emphasis is on the great value of the treasure. The great value of the treasure itself and the great joy that the person has on finding the treasure and making the treasure their own. Now let's dig into how he gets there. The first thing I notice here is that this whole finding something of value, the finding the treasure, in the stories Jesus told, it's completely unexpected. It seems like this guy here in the story, he's not a treasure hunter. He's just out working his field, digging around, and he happens to find the buried treasure out there in the field. Same thing with the pearl of great value. The merchant's job is looking for pearls, so he's just out doing his job, and then he finds this one that nobody's ever seen before. And Jesus is telling us, God's story's a little bit like that too. Unexpected. God's story's an unexpected story. A story of unexpected and unbounded and surprisingly generous love. God's story is undeserved love to us, not us trying to get something as a reward for especially good behavior. God's story is unconditional love for us, not God expecting people to earn their way into his good graces. God's story is mercy and grace, not just to the sort of maybe close to deserving, but even and maybe especially to the undeserving. God's story is giving of himself, not making us climb up to do things for him. God's story is generosity to everybody, not just rewarding those who can name it and claim it. God's story is humbling himself and suffering and dying on a cross so that he could freely give us all the riches of heaven. And that's quite unexpected. That's by nature, we don't think of God in those sort of terms. Here's another thing that's unexpected. It's unexpected that this treasure, which is faith in Jesus, it's unexpected that it's any better or more valuable than what we already have. A couple of ways you can come at that. First is that there's lots of other religions and lots of other sacred texts out there, and Satan whispers in our ears, especially in our culture today, well, aren't those all just different roads to the same place? Aren't they equally valuable? Isn't the Bible just one of any number of valid and important spiritual texts? Isn't following Jesus just one way of any other valid alternatives? In our world, it's quite unexpected that one way, Jesus' way, might be the only true way to God. And here's another thing. For many people, life without Jesus really doesn't seem all that bad. I mean, they might not be rich, but overall they're pretty satisfied with life. They don't seem to have any great catastrophes to deal with, no great lifestyle crashes or failures to recover from. They treat people pretty good, and they're pretty good people. So for the most part, people are pretty satisfied with what they have and where they are and how things are going. I mean, maybe 18 months of COVID's poked a few holes in that for some people, but still, for a lot of people, life seems okay without Jesus in it. And they can't quite figure out the vague feeling of unsettledness and dissatisfaction and emptiness and the something's a little off that's there. And they figure that's just normal. So they don't realize what they're missing. But if and when they discover the difference that Jesus can make in their lives, then it's like, well, wow, I wasn't expecting that. I thought I already had what I needed. And now I see I have so much more. And that's starting to get at Jesus' point. Okay, Jesus' point that a relationship with him is a treasure. And a relationship with God is a treasure that's a far greater value than anything that we currently have or could possibly have in the future. It's actually of infinite value. Infinite value because of what this treasure cost God. Remember, it cost Jesus his life. Infinite value because of what you gain long term. And what your long-term gain is eternal life. And a world that's perfect forever. And all the riches of heaven. And it's also of infinite value because of, well, what you gain here and now. Characteristics and attitudes and ways of dealing with things that put you in better places. So before we continue on this conversation, I want you to pause and think about that for a minute. Think about what for you, what is the value of the treasure that Jesus is talking about here. Now I'm going to play a short little video to sort of jumpstart your thinking. Maybe it'll bring to mind a few things that you haven't thought of in a while, or maybe a few things that you've taken for granted. Here's what I want you to do. After watching that video, I want you to go ahead and hit pause. There's a slide going to be coming up, and I want you to think about this question. What special value do you see in a relationship with Jesus? For me, that was pretty valuable time, reflecting on the treasure that Jesus is. Because I've been a believer for a long time, and sometimes I kind of forget the great value of that treasure. Maybe forget isn't the right word. Maybe it's that I don't feel the same joy and excitement in the treasure that I once did. But if you read the story closely, joy is where Jesus wants us to get. So how do we get to that place? Well, let me take you back into the story. A couple of sentences. Verse 45, in his joy, he went and sold everything that he had. In verse 46, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Now what you see there first in these stories is there's a willingness to give up everything in order to get this newly found treasure. Now, to be willing to do that, to give up everything you have for this newfound treasure, you first have to recognize the treasure for what it is. A treasure of infinitely greater value than what you already have. And that's what you do when you say yes to Jesus' invitation and receive him with your heart. But still, give up everything for it? Now that was a twist that Jesus' audience, so steeped in the earn it, worked for it culture, even in faith and religion, probably didn't see coming at all. I mean, what they probably thought that this was pretty difficult to understand. You see, in Jewish tradition at the time, their legal precedent, what you might call rabbinic law, there was a law about finding hidden treasure. And the rabbis summarized it this way. What finds belongs to the finder. What you find belongs to the finder. So in the listener's minds, the guy in the story already had a legal claim to it. He found it. And because he found it, he earned the right to it. Right? What finds belongs to the finder. So they're thinking, they're hearing, hey, it's legitimately his, he should be cashing in. And the way Jesus tells the story, that's not what the guy does. He immediately goes out and he sells everything that he has to get possession of this treasure, and the audience is probably really confused by this twist. They're thinking, well, why would he do that? Isn't there a risk in doing that rather than claiming the treasure right away? And his audience is probably thinking, well, yeah, what if somebody else comes back and finds this treasure before he gets back and is able to buy the field? What if they discover the pearl before he's able to come back and get it for himself? There's going to be some competing claims to this treasure then, and then maybe he went through everything for nothing. Why'd he do that if he already earned it, right? What finds belongs to the finder. But is that really true? Is it really true that he would have gone through all that effort for nothing? A couple things to consider there. At worst, first of all, if he sold everything, what do you do with his stuff? He didn't get rid of it, he just liquidated it, right? The value of the stuff is still there. He just sold it and liquidated it so he could get something more, something better, something that he wanted. That kind of reminds me of something called Pascal's wager. Pascal was a French philosopher from the 1600s, and he said this. I'm going to read his exact quote. Let us weigh the gain and the loss of wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain, you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then without hesitation that he is. What he's saying there is if either God exists or he doesn't. And if God doesn't exist and you believe that he does, he's saying, what have you really lost? You haven't lost anything. But if you say God doesn't exist and he does, then you've lost everything. So wager on God. And that's what these guys in the story are doing. They're wagering on the treasure. And then there's something else below the surface that I think we need to see as well. You need to see that Jesus' big point here again is about the value of the treasure, not the action of the people. It's not a story about us. It's a story about God. And Jesus wants us to see here the value of a relationship with Him. A value so great that you'd be willing to risk everything in order to get it. And then if you dig a little deeper, Jesus also wants you to see this, that there's actually no risk of losing the treasure once you decide to go for it. That Jesus wants you to understand that, and so He puts this story that He tells here after some other stories that He told in Matthew chapter 13. Those other stories that came first, Jesus was making the point that God loves everybody, and that God wants everybody to be in a relationship with Him forever, and that Jesus died for everyone to make that possible for everyone. And so with that as the backdrop to this story, Jesus wants us to see that the treasure isn't just of infinite value, it's also of infinite size. Meaning that everyone who wants to have it for themselves can have it. The whole thing. And everything that comes with it, just as much as anyone else. Now, do you have to give up something to get it? Well, yeah, Jesus put it this way a couple chapters later, Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Let me read it to you. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And that denying self, that's hard. And it seems kind of risky to us because self and self first is all we know by nature. And self first is pretty hard to give up. But giving up self first, Jesus says, is the way to infinitely greater treasure and the way from that treasure to an infinitely greater joy. Now again, part of that joy is seen in the long-term results that you get from a relationship with Jesus. Eternal life in heaven, a perfect existence forever, all the riches of heaven. But the way Jesus told the story, the joy isn't just in the future payoff. Jesus puts the accent right in the here and now. He puts the accent on the joy right in the here and now before the guy even took full possession of the treasure. Let me take you back to that sentence in verse 45. After the guy found the treasure, Jesus tells this: in his joy, he went and sold everything he had. Now, did you catch the timing there? What Jesus says is the guy had joy when he found the treasure in the first place, before he ever went and was able to enjoy all of it for himself. And he had joy when he went and sold his stuff. Joy in the anticipation of what he was going to get. When he sold his stuff is, in spiritual terms, denying self. He's got joy in what he found even before he could enjoy all of it, what I talked about as those future eternal benefits. And that's what Jesus is trying to tell us here. There's joy not just in the future, but in the now. Let me get at that this way. I'm thinking back to my own life and how I used to be kind of jealous of people who had these huge conversion stories. It was like, my life's a mess, everything's going wrong, I'm doing everything wrong, I'm falling apart. Then I met Jesus and I was totally changed. I didn't have a story like that. And I thought that my testimony was going to be kind of weak by comparison. But then I was talking with a friend who had a story exactly like that. And I was telling him how, I wished I had a story like his. And he said, I was living that life for 20-some years, and I think just the reverse. I wish I had a story like yours that knew Jesus for a long time, because I think of all the joy I missed out on and all the pain and heartache that I had from pursuing life that way. And I was like, never really thought of it that way before. But it's true, and I think it makes sense of helps me make sense of what Jesus is saying here in this story. What he's saying is, when you deny yourself and when you chase after Jesus, you don't only find Jesus, you start to discover joy. Joy in doing things God's way, and finding out that when you're keeping the commandments, God's actually protecting you from things that are hurtful or harmful. Joy in new characteristics and actions and attitudes that start growing in your life and making your life and the lives of those around you better. Things like Paul describes as the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Finding joy in a new way of looking at life that, and found this out in 2020 defies circumstances and gives a peace that passes understanding. And joy in discovering that no matter how weird or stressful or uncertain or unstable that life becomes, that your greatest treasure, that relationship with Jesus, it can't be taken away. And that Jesus is going to be both with you and for you, even in the mess. Now, that really became clear to me in the past 18 months or so of COVID world. And maybe you discovered something similar. If you haven't, I want to invite you right now to take these stories to heart and to take a risk. To give up self to get a much greater and lasting treasure, Jesus. And to discover the sort of deep joy that you can begin to have right now. Joy that you weren't even sure is possible. And if you did that, I want to invite you to email me, pastor@concordiachurch.com, so that I can celebrate with you. And if you want, we can have a conversation about some next steps. If, like me, you've been a believer for a while, and the treasure's already yours, you've already grabbed that treasure, then what I want to invite you to do is to listen to the podcast of our on-site message. It's a different message than this one. It looks at a different aspect of this story. Really focuses and digs us into our actions and reactions. Kind of going to focus on this. Now that you have the treasure and that you understand its value, what are you doing with it? And more specifically, how do you keep, or if you've lost it, how do you recover the joy that you had in finding it? That'll be up in our podcast section sometime on Monday.